She walked onto the firing range, wearing a worn denim jacket and sneakers that had seen better days. The instructors took one look at her contractor badge and started placing bets on how badly she'd embarrass herself. Then she picked up the rifle, and every shot found its mark with surgical precision. But it wasn't until she rolled up her sleeve that the visiting SEAL leader's face went white. Because the ink on her wrist told a story that wasn't supposed to exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air at Fort Brennan carried the smell of gunpowder and diesel fuel, mixed with the kind of dry heat that made your throat scratch before you'd even started talking. It was barely past 7, but the Nevada sun was already turning the concrete walkways into heat mirrors. Somewhere beyond the chain-link perimeter, the distant rumble of morning traffic on Route 95 provided a steady backdrop to the sharper sounds of military life: boots on gravel, diesel engines turning over, the metallic clang of equipment being moved and sorted. Jessica Torres stepped out of the white government van, her civilian clothes immediately marking her as an outsider in this world of uniform precision. She wore faded jeans with frayed edges, a denim jacket that had been through too many wash cycles, and white canvas sneakers that looked like they'd been purchased at a discount store rather than earned through service. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with the unhurried movements of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Clipped to her jacket pocket was a temporary access badge, the kind they issued to contractors and civilian personnel who needed to maintain their security clearances. The laminated card swayed slightly as she walked, catching the morning light and reflecting it in brief flashes that seemed to announce her outsider status to anyone paying attention. The photo on the badge showed a woman with lighter hair and a more relaxed expression. Taken sometime in the recent past when she'd probably been sitting in some sterile government office, going through the bureaucratic motions required to keep her paperwork current. The rifle range at Fort Brennan was a sprawling complex of concrete barriers and steel framework, designed to handle everything from basic marksmanship training to advanced tactical scenarios. This early in the morning, it was already busy with the steady rotation of personnel who needed to maintain their qualifications. The air was filled with the intermittent crack of rifle fire, punctuated by shouted commands from range safety officers and the electronic beeps of automated target systems. Near the equipment shed, a group of instructors had already spotted Jessica's arrival and were making their assessments with the casual cruelty that comes from years of watching weekend warriors and desk personnel struggle through mandatory training. Staff Sergeant Rick Donovan stood with his arms crossed, his instructor polo stretched tight across a frame that had grown soft during 5 years of stateside duty. Once upon a time, he'd been infantry, the kind who'd humped gear through Iraq and Afghanistan, but those days felt like a different lifetime now. Beside him, Sergeant First Class Tony Ramirez squinted at the morning paperwork through reading glasses he'd finally admitted he needed. His own combat days were behind him now, replaced by the comfortable predictability of training civilians and reservists who rotated through their facility in an endless stream of mandatory qualifications and checkbox exercises. Both men had developed an expertise in sizing up the people who came through their range, and they'd learned to spot the ones who would struggle before they'd even touched a weapon. It was a skill born of experience and reinforced by countless repetitions of the same basic scenario: civilian contractors who'd let their skills atrophy, weekend warriors who talked a better game than they could deliver, and administrative personnel who treated their annual qualifications like a necessary evil to be endured rather than a skill to be maintained. "Check this out," Donovan muttered to his partner, nodding in Jessica's direction. "Contractor badge, civilian clothes, and look at those shoes. Bet she hasn't touched a rifle since her initial certification." Ramirez glanced up from his clipboard, taking in Jessica's appearance with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to make quick judgments. "Probably works in finance or logistics," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough to be heard by the other personnel in the area. "Gets sent out here once a year to check a box on some form, then goes back to her desk job and forgets everything she learned." Their commentary wasn't particularly cruel by military standards, just the kind of casual assessment that came naturally after years of dealing with people who viewed marksmanship training as an unwelcome interruption to their regular duties. They'd seen it all before: the nervous fumbling with unfamiliar weapons, the excuses about not having practiced in months, the obvious relief when the training was finally over and they could return to their comfortable air-conditioned offices. Near the intake desk, a young corporal was organizing the morning's schedule with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested he'd rather be doing almost anything else. When Jessica approached, he barely looked up from his coffee and paperwork, already mentally categorizing her as just another routine qualification that needed to be processed. "Lane 12, he said without making eye contact, sliding a range card across the metal counter. "Down at the far end, you'll find everything you need down there." Lane 12 was exactly what Jessica had expected, the kind of position they assigned to people they wanted to forget about. It was at the far end of the complex, where the concrete walls created awkward acoustics and the morning shadows made target acquisition more challenging. The lane had obviously seen heavy use, with worn spots in the concrete where countless shooters had knelt and prone positions that had been ground smooth by years of elbows and knees. Jessica set her compact black gear bag on the scarred wooden bench and began unpacking with movements that suggested this wasn't her first time preparing for a shooting qualification. Her equipment was modest but well-maintained. Custom-fitted ear protection that had been molded specifically for her ears, soft leather shooting gloves with reinforced fingertips, and a small toolkit containing sight adjustment tools that showed signs of regular use. Every piece of gear told a story of someone who took shooting seriously, even if she didn't look the part at first glance. The ear protection fit perfectly, suggesting she'd invested in proper equipment rather than relying on the foam plugs that most casual shooters used. The gloves were broken in but not worn out, the kind that came from regular practice rather than occasional use. Even her gear bag was organized with a kind of systematic precision that spoke of established routines and ingrained habits. Behind her, the commentary from the instructors continued with the easy confidence of people who were certain they knew what they were looking at. A small group of reservists had gathered near the equipment shed, drawn by the novelty of watching what they assumed would be another struggling civilian contractor. $20 says she can't keep all her shots on paper, one of them said, loud enough for his voice to carry across the morning air. "Look at those clothes. Probably think this is some kind of recreational activity." His partner, a young specialist who'd been through basic training but hadn't seen any real deployment, laughed at his own cleverness. "Bet she asks for help loading the magazine. These contractor types never remember the basics once they get comfortable behind a desk." The weapon they'd assigned to Jessica was standard military issue, an M4 carbine that had seen extensive use in training scenarios. The serial numbers had been re-etched multiple times, and the furniture showed the kind of wear that came from being handled by thousands of different shooters over the years. It was the kind of rifle that had probably fired more training rounds than most soldiers would see in their entire careers, but it was properly maintained and mechanically sound. Jessica's hands moved over the weapon with practiced efficiency, conducting the kind of detailed inspection that most people skipped in their eagerness to get started. She checked the bolt carrier group, tested the trigger pull, adjusted the sling to fit her frame, and ran her thumb along the receiver to check for any signs of unusual wear or damage. The weapon told her its story in the span of 30 seconds, how it had been maintained, where it had been stored, whether it was likely to function reliably under stress. It was the kind of detailed assessment that came from experience, from having worked with weapons in situations where mechanical failure wasn't just inconvenient but potentially fatal. She could read the history of the rifle in its wear patterns, understand its quirks and characteristics, and make the small adjustments necessary to ensure optimal performance. The morning heat was beginning to build, and the concrete surfaces were starting to radiate warmth that made the air shimmer slightly. Other shooters were beginning their qualifications at the adjacent lanes, filling the air with the steady rhythm of controlled pairs and precision shots. But at lane 12, Jessica was still methodically preparing, taking the time to ensure that everything was exactly as it needed to be. When she finally chambered her first round, the bolt slid home with a crisp, authoritative sound that cut through the ambient noise of the range. It was a small detail, but one that suggested familiarity with the weapon and confidence in its operation. She settled into her firing stance with movements that seemed natural and unrehearsed, finding her position without the kind of fumbling and adjustment that characterized most civilian shooters. The electronic range system activated with its characteristic tone, and Jessica raised her rifle to firing position. From her posture and grip, it was clear that she'd done this before, though the instructors watching from behind were still expecting to see the kind of performance that would confirm their initial assessments. What they didn't expect was what happened next. Jessica's first shot rang out across the range with a clean, sharp report that made several nearby shooters glance in her direction. The sound was crisp and controlled, without the hesitation or fumbling that typically characterize civilian contractors working through their annual qualifications. But when the electronic scoring system displayed her result, the instructors felt vindicated in their initial assessment. The shot had found the target, but it was off-center, catching the outer scoring ring rather than the bullseye. It was the kind of result that would pass any basic military standard. But it wasn't impressive enough to change anyone's opinion about the woman in the denim jacket and discount store sneakers. "Called it," Donovan said with satisfaction, marking something on his clipboard. "First shot always tells you everything you need to know." Probably learned everything she knows from some weekend course at a civilian range. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ramirez nodded, already losing interest in turning his attention to other shooters who might provide more entertainment. "Give it 3 more shots, and she'll be asking for help with her sight adjustment. They always do." The group of reservists who'd been watching with casual amusement felt their expectations confirmed. The younger specialist, Marcus Webb, had been in the Army for less than 2 years, but had already developed the kind of cocky confidence that came from basic training and limited real-world experience. "Told you guys," he said loud enough for his voice to carry down the firing line. "These contractor types are all the same. They talk like they know what they're doing, but when it comes to actual performance, they fold every time. Probably hasn't touched a rifle since her initial certification." His partner, Private First Class Danny Kim, had been through more training but was equally eager to demonstrate his superior knowledge. "Look at her stance. She's fighting the recoil instead of controlling it. Basic marksmanship principles. They probably gave her a safety briefing and threw her out here without any real instruction." What the observers didn't notice was how Jessica absorbed the result of her first shot without any visible reaction. She didn't adjust her position immediately, didn't show frustration or confusion, and didn't look around for guidance or assistance. Instead, she took a slow, controlled breath and made a minute adjustment to her stance. A shift so small it was barely perceptible unless you knew what to look for. The adjustment wasn't random or hesitant. It was the kind of precise correction that came from understanding exactly how that first shot had deviated from her point of aim and knowing exactly what needed to be changed to compensate. She shifted her weight forward perhaps an inch, adjusted her grip on the pistol grip by the smallest possible margin, and corrected her sight picture based on the feedback from that initial round. When she fired her second shot, the result was dramatically different. The round punched through the target's center ring with authority, creating a clean hole exactly where she'd intended it to go. The electronic scoring system registered a perfect score, and the sound of the impact carried a different quality, the distinctive snap of a bullet hitting its mark with precision. The third shot joined it, opening up the group by perhaps half an inch, but staying well within the highest scoring ring. The fourth shot tightened the group again, and by the fifth shot, a pattern was emerging that made the casual conversation among the observers begin to fade. Jessica was shooting with metronomic precision, each shot fired at measured intervals that suggested complete control over her breathing, trigger pull, and sight alignment. There was no rushing, no showing off, no attempt to impress anyone watching. She was simply placing rounds exactly where she wanted them to go, as if the distance between her muzzle and the target was just a mathematical problem to be solved, rather than a challenge to be overcome. By the seventh shot, the range had grown noticeably quieter. Other shooters at adjacent lanes were beginning to notice the consistency of the reports coming from lane 12, and several had paused in their own firing to glance in Jessica's direction. The grouping she was creating was tighter than anything most of them could manage on their best days, and she was doing it with an unfamiliar weapon on an unfamiliar range. Sergeant First Class Ramirez found himself walking closer to get a better view of her target. What he saw made him stop completely and reconsider everything he thought he knew about the woman in civilian clothes. The grouping was impossibly tight for someone using military-issue equipment, the kind of precision that belonged in competition shooting or specialized training programs. Each hole in the target was placed with surgical accuracy, creating a cluster that could be covered by a silver dollar. It was the kind of shooting that came from somewhere deeper than basic training or annual qualifications. It spoke of muscle memory worn into the very fibers of her being, of countless hours spent perfecting the fundamental skills that most people never truly mastered. Staff Sergeant Donovan felt his confident assessment beginning to crumble as he watched Jessica reload with smooth, practiced movements. She ejected the spent magazine, seated a fresh one, and chambered another round without taking her eyes off the target. The entire sequence took perhaps 3 seconds and was performed with the kind of fluid efficiency that suggested she'd done it thousands of times before. "Where the hell did she learn to shoot like that?" Donovan muttered, loud enough for Ramirez to hear but quiet enough to avoid admitting his mistake to the reservists who were still watching. For the first time since arriving at Fort Brennan, Jessica turned to look directly at him. Her eyes were a pale green, almost gray, with the kind of steady focus that made people uncomfortable when it was directed at them. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, carrying no hint of defensiveness or pride. "Long before I needed permission to be here." Something in her tone made Donovan take a step back. It wasn't threatening or aggressive, but it carried an undertone of absolute certainty that suggested she wasn't someone who made idle statements or felt the need to prove herself through words rather than actions. Ramirez moved closer, trying to reassert some form of authority through proximity. As a senior instructor, he was accustomed to being the expert in any conversation about marksmanship, and Jessica's performance was challenging assumptions he'd held for years. "Ma'am, I need to ask about your background," he said, adopting the kind of formal tone that was meant to remind everyone present of the hierarchy. "Your file lists you as non-combat support, but that kind of shooting suggests otherwise." Jessica turned back to her lane and began preparing for her next string of fire. "You have my paperwork," she said simply, as if that should be sufficient to answer any questions about her qualifications or background. "The paperwork says civilian contractor, administrative support," Ramirez pressed. "But contractors don't shoot like that. That's the kind of grouping I see from our advanced marksmanship instructors, and some of them can't manage it consistently. Maybe your paperwork is incomplete." The response was delivered without any particular emphasis, but it carried implications that made both instructors exchange uncertain glances. In their experience, people with hidden military backgrounds were usually eager to share their credentials, especially when their competence was being questioned. They didn't deflect with quiet confidence or treat their abilities as unremarkable. As Jessica continued her firing sequence, more details began to emerge that suggested her civilian contractor facade might not tell the complete story. Her shooting position was textbook perfect, but it was the kind of textbook that went beyond basic military training. She maintained perfect consistency shot after shot, even as the morning heat began to build and other shooters started to show signs of fatigue or distraction. More importantly, she showed none of the small tells that characterized even experienced civilian shooters. She didn't flinch from the sound of her own weapon, or the rifles being fired at adjacent lanes. She didn't show any startled response when the range safety officer used his whistle to signal a ceasefire for target changes. Her breathing remained controlled and measured, even as the ambient temperature climbed toward uncomfortable levels. Private First Class Kim had stopped making jokes and was now watching with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was learning something important. "Sergeant, have you ever seen shooting like that from a contractor?" he asked quietly. Ramirez shook his head slowly. In 5 years of range instruction, he'd seen thousands of civilian personnel work through their qualifications. Some were better than others, and a few showed real aptitude for marksmanship. But none had demonstrated the kind of mechanical precision that Jessica was displaying. It was the kind of shooting that came from somewhere beyond weekend training or annual refresher courses. When Jessica paused to reload again, Donovan noticed something that made his blood run cold. As she reached for her spare magazines, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo on her left wrist. It was just a glimpse. Black ink that looked like it had been applied professionally rather than in some back alley parlor. Military tattoos were common enough, but something about the design and placement suggested this wasn't just decorative body art. The lines were clean and precise, the kind of work that spoke of military tradition rather than personal expression. More importantly, it was positioned exactly where someone would place ink that had specific meaning within military culture. "Ramirez," Donovan whispered, nodding toward Jessica's partially visible tattoo. "Look at her wrist." Ramirez squinted, trying to make out details without being obvious about his scrutiny. What he could see was clearly professional work, definitely military in nature, but the design was partially obscured by her sleeve, and the angle made it difficult to identify specific elements. "Is that what I think it is?" Ramirez asked quietly. Before Donovan could respond, Jessica completed her magazine change and resumed firing. Her next 5 shots created another impossibly tight group, each round finding the exact center of the target with the kind of consistency that belonged in training manuals rather than real-world demonstrations. The younger reservists had fallen completely silent now, and several other shooters at nearby lanes had stopped their own firing to watch. Jessica's performance was becoming the focal point of the entire range, though she seemed completely unaware of the attention she was drawing. Marcus Webb, the specialist who'd been so confident about her likely failure, found himself studying every aspect of her shooting technique. Her stance, her grip, her breathing pattern, the way she called her shots before the electronic scoring system confirmed her accuracy. Everything suggested a level of training that went far beyond civilian contractor requirements. "Jesus," he muttered to Kim, "where do you think she learned to shoot like that?" Kim shook his head, equally mystified. "I don't know, but it's not from any contractor training program I've heard of. That's the kind of shooting you see from people who've had serious professional instruction." As the morning progressed and Jessica continued to demonstrate her capabilities, a different kind of tension began to build on the range. The initial mockery and casual dismissal had given way to uncomfortable silence and growing questions about who this woman really was, and where she'd acquired skills that seemed to belong in a completely different category of military training. The instructors found themselves in the awkward position of having their professional judgment completely undermined by someone they'd written off as another routine qualification. More troubling was the growing suspicion that Jessica's background might include elements that weren't reflected in her official paperwork. When she finally completed her firing sequence and began the post-shooting safety procedures, the range remained unnaturally quiet. Jessica's final target showed a grouping that would have been impressive for competition shooters using custom equipment, let alone someone firing military-issue weapons on a qualification course. As she began cleaning her weapon with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the morning, Donovan realized that everything they thought they knew about the woman in civilian clothes might be completely wrong. And if her shooting was any indication, the story behind that tattoo on her wrist might be far more significant than anyone had imagined. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the concrete barriers and turning the metal framework of the range into a grid of heat distortion. Other qualification groups had rotated through their lanes, but word of the extraordinary shooting at Lane 12 had begun to spread through the facility like wildfire. Personnel who had no business being near the rifle range found excuses to walk past, catching glimpses of the woman whose performance was rapidly becoming the subject of hushed conversations throughout Fort Brennan. Master Sergeant Angela Rodriguez had been running the range operations for 3 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when something unusual was happening on her facility. The steady stream of personnel finding reasons to observe Lane 12 had caught her attention, and she'd made her way over to investigate what was drawing so much interest. Rodriguez was a career military, the kind of professional who'd earned her position through competence rather than politics. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer, seen real action, and had little patience for the kind of casual sexism that sometimes infected training facilities. When she arrived at the observation area behind Lane 12, she expected to find either genuine excellence worth acknowledging or manufactured drama that needed to be shut down. What she found was Jessica Torres methodically working through an advanced shooting sequence that had no business being performed during a basic contractor qualification. The woman was engaging multiple target configurations at varying distances, transitioning between positions with fluid precision, and maintaining accuracy standards that belonged in specialized military training programs rather than administrative refresher courses. "What exactly is going on here?" Rodriguez asked Donovan, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the vicinity straighten their posture slightly. Donovan found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining how his initial assessment had been completely wrong. "Ma'am, we assigned her a standard qualification course, but she's been shooting like this all morning. Perfect groups, no coaching required, handling that weapon like she's been using it for years." Rodriguez observed Jessica's next sequence in silence. The woman was engaging targets at maximum range for the facility. placing shots with mechanical precision that suggested training far beyond civilian contractor requirements. More intriguingly, she was doing it without any visible reference to range cards, elevation charts, or the kind of support materials that most shooters relied on for long-distance work. "Has anyone asked her about her background?" Rodriguez inquired. "We tried," Ramirez admitted. "She's deflecting. Says her paperwork tells the whole story, but the paperwork lists her as administrative support. Nobody shoots like that coming from a desk job." Rodriguez made a mental note to review Jessica's file more carefully. In her experience, people with exceptional military skills didn't usually end up in civilian contractor positions unless there were circumstances that weren't immediately apparent. The kind of circumstances that sometimes involved classified programs, medical disabilities, or personal situations that forced career changes. Meanwhile, Jessica had become aware of the growing attention, but seemed determined to complete her qualification regardless of who was watching. She'd moved to advanced firing positions that weren't part of any standard contractor course. Prone shooting from behind barriers, rapid engagement sequences that tested both accuracy and speed, and precision work at distances that pushed the limits of the range's capabilities. Each evolution demonstrated mastery of techniques that took years to develop. Her transitions between positions were smooth and economical, suggesting training and tactical movement. Her target engagement followed patterns that belonged in combat shooting courses rather than basic qualifications. Most tellingly, she was calling her shots with absolute confidence, predicting exactly where each round would impact before the electronic scoring systems could confirm her accuracy. Private First Class Kim had abandoned any pretense of conducting his own training and was openly studying Jessica's techniques. As someone relatively new to military life, he'd assumed that exceptional shooting was rare and usually accompanied by obvious indicators of elite training. Jessica's performance was forcing him to reconsider what competence actually looked like. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said quietly, "is it normal for contractors to shoot like that?" Rodriguez shook her head slowly. "No, soldier, it's not. That's the kind of shooting you see from people who've had very specialized training. The kind that usually comes with stories attached." As if summoned by their conversation, Jessica's sleeve rode up again as she adjusted her position for the next firing sequence. This time, the tattoo on her wrist was clearly visible to everyone watching. The design was unmistakably military. A detailed rendering of crossed arrows beneath a stylized mountain peak, executed in the kind of precise black ink that spoke of professional artistry rather than casual body modification. Rodriguez felt her breath catch. She recognized the design, though she'd only seen it a few times in her career. It wasn't the kind of tattoo that soldiers picked up casually or had done at random parlors near military bases. It was specific, meaningful, and traditionally associated with units that officially didn't exist in any organizational charts. "Holy shit," Donovan whispered, forgetting military protocol in his surprise. "Is that what I think it is?" Rodriguez didn't answer immediately. The tattoo design was bringing back memories of classified briefings, conversations that had happened in secure facilities, and references to operations that were never discussed in official channels. She'd encountered personnel with similar ink exactly twice in her career, both times in contexts that had required special security clearances and need-to-know authorization. The crossed arrows beneath the mountain peak were associated with high-altitude reconnaissance units that operated in terrain and conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits, the kind of units that inserted personnel into hostile territory for extended periods, conducting surveillance and intelligence gathering in environments where extraction might not be possible for weeks or months. If Jessica Torres had earned the right to wear that tattoo, her presence at a routine contractor qualification represented a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. People with that background didn't usually transition to civilian contractor positions unless circumstances had forced them out of active service. Jessica completed her final shooting sequence and began the post-firing safety procedures with the same methodical precision she'd demonstrated throughout the morning. Her target displayed results that would have been impressive for competitive shooters using custom equipment, let alone someone working with standard military-issue weapons. As she began field stripping her weapon, Rodriguez made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire morning. She approached Lane 12 directly, abandoning the pretense of casual observation. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you," Rodriguez said, using the kind of formal tone that suggested official business rather than casual conversation. Jessica looked up from her weapon maintenance, meeting Rodriguez's gaze with steady attention. "Sergeant?" "That's an interesting piece of artwork you're carrying," Rodriguez said, nodding toward the now visible tattoo. "Would you mind telling me where you had it done?" For the first time since arriving at Fort Brennan, Jessica's carefully maintained composure showed the slightest crack. Not fear or anxiety, but the kind of careful calculation that suggested she was weighing how much information to reveal. "It's personal," she said finally. "I'm sure it is. But that particular design has significance that goes beyond personal expression. I've seen it exactly twice in my career, both times in contexts that required special clearances." Jessica resumed cleaning her weapon, but Rodriguez could see tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Rodriguez persisted gently. "The mountain peak and crossed arrows. High-altitude reconnaissance. Ring any bells?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone within earshot had stopped their activities to listen, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. The casual atmosphere of routine training had given way to something that felt more like an interrogation, though Rodriguez was keeping her tone carefully neutral. Jessica's hands never paused in their methodical cleaning of the rifle components, but her silence spoke volumes. In Rodriguez's experience, people who genuinely had no connection to specialized military units either looked confused or became curious about the implication. They didn't maintain careful silence while considering their responses. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to cause problems," Rodriguez continued. "But if you have background that's relevant to your current position, it might explain some of the questions that are starting to develop around your performance here." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that develops when someone demonstrates capabilities that don't match their official documentation. Your shooting this morning has been—" Rodriguez paused, searching for the right terminology. "Exceptional. Beyond what we typically see from civilian personnel, regardless of their background." Jessica assembled her weapon with movements that seemed automatic, requiring no conscious attention. "Maybe your expectations are too low." It was a deflection, but delivered with enough confidence to suggest that Jessica wasn't intimidated by the scrutiny. If anything, she seemed to be growing more comfortable as the conversation continued, as if direct questions were preferable to the speculation that had been building around her presence. Rodriguez decided to take a different approach. "How long since you've been out of active service?" The question was based on assumption rather than confirmed knowledge, but Jessica's reaction confirmed its accuracy. She went completely still for perhaps 2 seconds before continuing her post-firing routine. "I never said I was former military. You didn't have to. Everything about your performance this morning says it for you. The question is, what kind of military background produces that level of competence?" Rodriguez was fishing now, trying to extract information that might explain the disconnect between Jessica's official status and her demonstrated capabilities. The tattoo was a significant clue, but it wasn't conclusive evidence of anything specific. People sometimes acquired military-style tattoos without having earned them through service, though the quality and placement of Jessica's ink suggested authenticity. "The crossed arrows," Rodriguez pressed. "That's not something you pick up at a random tattoo parlor. That's earned ink, and it's earned in very specific circumstances." Jessica stood and shouldered her gear bag, signaling that she was ready to conclude her range time. "Is there anything else you need for my qualification record?" The deflection was smooth but unmistakable. Jessica was ending the conversation on her terms, providing just enough cooperation to complete her official business, while avoiding any substantive discussion of her background. Rodriguez realized she was at a decision point. She could press harder, potentially creating an official incident that would require paperwork and explanations to higher authority, or she could let Jessica complete her qualification and disappear back into whatever civilian life she'd built for herself. Before Rodriguez could decide, the sound of vehicle engines approaching the range complex interrupted the tense conversation. A convoy of black SUVs was approaching the main gate, the kind of official transportation that usually indicated visiting VIPs or unscheduled inspections. The timing was probably coincidental, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's presence at Fort Brennan and the arrival of unannounced official visitors might be connected in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Jessica had noticed the approaching vehicles as well, and Rodriguez saw something flicker across her expression. Not fear, but the kind of careful attention that suggested the arrival might not be entirely unexpected. "Expecting someone?" Rodriguez asked. Jessica's response was barely audible over the sound of diesel engines and gravel crunching under heavy tires. "There's always someone." The cryptic answer did nothing to resolve the growing mystery surrounding the woman with extraordinary shooting skills and military-grade tattoos, who insisted she was nothing more than a civilian contractor requiring routine qualification. As the convoy pulled through the main gate, Rodriguez realized that whatever was about to happen would likely provide answers to the questions that had been building throughout the morning. The only question was whether those answers would resolve the mystery or deepen it further. The black SUVs rolled through the range complex with a kind of deliberate authority that made everyone present instinctively check their appearance and posture. These weren't the standard government vehicles that typically visited Fort Brennan for routine inspections or administrative meetings. The convoy moved with purpose, and the personnel visible through the tinted windows carried themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to being the most important individuals in any room they entered. Master Sergeant Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the lead vehicle's license plates, official government designation that indicated federal authority above the typical military chain of command. In her experience, unscheduled visits from that level of authority usually meant either very good news or very serious problems, and the timing of their arrival during Jessica's qualification session felt far too coincidental to be random. The convoy came to a stop near the range administrative building, positioned where the occupants would have a clear view of all active firing lanes. The engines shut down in sequence, creating a moment of relative quiet that seemed to amplify the tension that had been building throughout the morning. From the lead vehicle emerged a man who immediately commanded attention despite wearing civilian clothes rather than military uniform. Commander David Blackwood was in his early 50s, with the kind of presence that came from decades of making decisions under pressure. His hair was silver at the temples, and a small scar above his left eyebrow caught the Nevada sunlight as he surveyed the range complex with practiced efficiency. Blackwood moved with the controlled economy of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. His civilian clothes were well-tailored but understated, the kind of professional attire that suggested federal authority without advertising specific branch or divisions. Most importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who expected cooperation rather than having to demand it. 2 additional personnel exited the remaining vehicles, clearly serving as escorts rather than primary authority. They maintained respectful distance while positioning themselves to observe the entire range complex, their attention focused outward rather than on their principal. Professional security, the kind that suggested Blackwood's visit, involved matters that required careful handling. Rodriguez realized she was holding her breath as Blackwood's attention swept across the range and settled on lane 12, where Jessica had just finished packing her equipment. The recognition was immediate and unmistakable. Not surprise, but the kind of focused attention that suggested he'd come here specifically looking for her. Jessica had noticed the arrivals as well, though her reaction was more controlled than those around her. She didn't show surprise or anxiety, but there was a subtle shift in her posture that suggested she was preparing for a conversation she'd been expecting, even if she hadn't known exactly when it would occur. Blackwood began walking in her direction with unhurried purpose, his escorts trailing at the appropriate distance. The entire range seemed to hold its breath as personnel throughout the complex became aware that something significant was about to unfold. "Torres," Blackwood said when he was close enough for normal conversation, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone within earshot straighten unconsciously. "Commander Blackwood." Jessica's response was steady and professional, acknowledging both his rank and their apparent familiarity. The casual way she used his name confirmed what Rodriguez had begun to suspect. This wasn't a chance encounter between strangers. "Still maintaining your qualifications, I see." Blackwood's tone was neutral, but there was an undercurrent of something that might have been approval or concern. "Heard you put on quite a demonstration this morning." Rodriguez felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The implication was clear. Blackwood hadn't just happened to arrive during Jessica's range time. He'd either been monitoring her activities or had been informed about her performance by someone who'd been watching. "Just keeping current," Jessica replied, her tone matching his careful neutrality. "Contract requirements." "Of course." Blackwood's slight smile suggested he understood layers of meaning that the eavesdropping personnel couldn't access. "Walk with me." It wasn't really a request, despite the phrasing. Jessica shouldered her gear bag and fell into step beside him as they moved away from the immediate cluster of observers. But they didn't go far enough to prevent the conversation from being overheard, which Rodriguez suspected was intentional rather than careless. "How are you adjusting to civilian life?" Blackwood asked, his voice carrying what seemed like genuine concern rather than professional courtesy. "One day at a time," Jessica answered. "The transition has been challenging." Rodriguez exchanged glances with Donovan and Ramirez, all three sharing the uncomfortable realization that they'd been completely wrong about the woman they'd dismissed as a routine contractor qualification. The conversation unfolding in front of them was clearly between people who shared history that went far beyond casual professional acquaintance. "I can imagine," Blackwood continued, "especially given the circumstances of your departure from active service. Have you given any thought to returning?" The question hung in the air with the weight of significant implications. Jessica was quiet for several seconds before responding, and when she did, her voice carried undertones that suggested complex emotions carefully held in check. "That chapter is closed, Commander. I've built something different now." "Have you? Or are you just maintaining cover until you decide what comes next?" Rodriguez felt her blood run cold at the casual reference to maintaining cover. In her experience, that terminology belonged to intelligence operations and classified activities that existed in the shadows of official military structure. If Jessica Torres had been operating undercover, her current civilian contractor status might be part of an ongoing mission rather than genuine career transition. Blackwood gestured toward the target display that still showed Jessica's morning performance. "That kind of precision doesn't fade with disuse. If anything, it looks like you've been practicing." "Muscle memory," Jessica deflected. "Some things you don't forget." "No, they don't. Especially when they're the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." The reference to mission-critical skills sent another chill through Rodriguez's assessment of the situation. She'd assumed Jessica's exceptional shooting was the result of advanced military training, but the conversation was suggesting something far more specialized and potentially ongoing. Private First Class Kim had moved closer, drawn by curiosity and the growing realization that he was witnessing something extraordinary. His young face showed the kind of fascination that came from recognizing that his understanding of military hierarchy and authority was being completely restructured. "Sir," he whispered to Rodriguez, "what kind of unit do you think she was with?" Rodriguez shook her head slightly, signaling for quiet. Whatever was unfolding between Jessica and Blackwood was clearly sensitive, and she had no desire to draw attention that might result in everyone being dismissed from the area. Blackwood had turned his attention to Jessica's partially visible tattoo, studying the design with the kind of recognition that confirmed Rodriguez's earlier suspicions about its significance. "Still carrying the mountain and arrows, I see," he observed. "Most people remove those when they transition out." "Some memories don't fade," Jessica replied, unconsciously adjusting her sleeve to cover the ink. "And some debts don't get paid." "The operation in Kashmir was a success. You saved lives." "I lost people." The stark exchange revealed depths of experience and trauma that made the morning speculation about Jessica's background seem trivial by comparison. Rodriguez realized they were hearing references to operations that probably existed only in classified files, the kind of missions that generated legends within the intelligence community, but never appeared in official records. Blackwood's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of genuine emotion since his arrival. "You lost 2 people out of a team of 12, during an operation that should have been impossible to survive. The intelligence community still studies that mission as an example of successful extraction under impossible circumstances. Tell that to Williams and Chen's families." The names were spoken with the kind of weight that came from personal responsibility and survivor's guilt. Rodriguez understood immediately that Jessica was carrying the burden of leadership decisions made under extreme pressure, the kind of moral weight that followed people long after they'd left active service. "You know that wasn't your fault," Blackwood said gently. "The weather conditions alone should have grounded the entire operation. The fact that 10 of you made it out is still considered miraculous." Jessica's jaw tightened visibly. Miraculous doesn't bring people home to their families. The conversation was revealing layers of Jessica's background that explained not only her exceptional skills but also her current civilian status. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that they were dealing with someone who'd left active service not due to incompetence or routine career transition, but because of trauma sustained during operations that pushed human endurance beyond normal limits. Blackwood seemed to recognize that he was approaching sensitive territory and shifted his approach. The offer remains open, you know. There are positions that would value your experience without requiring you to return to field operations. I've told you before, Commander, I'm done with that world. Are you? Because intelligence suggests otherwise. The statement carried implications that made everyone listening exchange uncomfortable glances. Rodriguez felt a growing certainty that Jessica's presence at Fort Brennan involved circumstances far more complex than routine contractor qualifications. What intelligence? Jessica's voice had taken on a sharper edge, the first sign of real tension she'd shown since Blackwood's arrival. The kind that suggests certain people are interested in your current activities. The kind that makes me concerned about your safety in civilian settings. Rodriguez realized with growing alarm that they might be witnessing the beginning of a situation that went far beyond military protocol and into realms of national security that required clearances she didn't possess. If Jessica Torres was being monitored by hostile intelligence services, her presence at a routine military facility could represent a security breach of unknown proportions. Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a briefing that carried life-or-death implications. There have been inquiries, people asking questions about former personnel with your specific skill set, the kind of inquiries that suggest someone is building target lists. Jessica went completely still, not frozen with fear, but with the kind of controlled alertness that suggested she was processing threat assessments and calculating response options. What kind of people? The kind that hold grudges about operations that were too successful for their comfort. The cryptic exchange was clearly referencing events and enemies that existed in the classified world of international intelligence operations. Rodriguez realized that Jessica's exceptional shooting skills might represent only a small fraction of capabilities that had made her valuable enough to warrant ongoing attention from both friendly and hostile intelligence services. The Nevada sun had reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the concrete barriers and turning the air into visible waves of heat distortion. The conversation between Jessica and Commander Blackwood had drawn the attention of virtually everyone on the range, though most were pretending to focus on their own activities while straining to catch fragments of dialogue that was clearly beyond routine military discussion. Master Sergeant Rodriguez found herself in the uncomfortable position of witnessing events that likely exceeded her security clearance, yet being unable to dismiss personnel who were equally transfixed by the unfolding drama. The casual mention of hostile intelligence interest had transformed what began as curiosity about exceptional marksmanship into something that carried genuine national security implications. Commander Blackwood studied Jessica's face with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was reading emotional states and psychological indicators, rather than simply conducting a casual conversation with a former colleague. His next words carried the weight of someone who understood the personal cost of the information he was about to share. The inquiries aren't random, Jessica. They're targeted, specific, and they're increasing in frequency. Someone is building a comprehensive picture of your current life, your routines, your vulnerabilities. Jessica's response was barely audible, spoken with the kind of controlled tension that suggested she was processing threat assessments in real time. How comprehensive? Comprehensive enough to make me drive out here personally instead of sending a message through official channels. Comprehensive enough to suggest that your civilian life might not remain viable much longer. The implication hung between them like a physical presence. Rodriguez realized she was witnessing the moment when Jessica's carefully constructed post-military existence was being challenged by forces that existed in the shadowy world of international intelligence operations. Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering an intelligence briefing. 3 months ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that certain parties were interested in locating former members of specialized mountain reconnaissance units. 2 months ago, those inquiries became more specific, focusing on personnel with your particular skill set. Last month, they started asking about individuals who'd participated in high-altitude extraction operations in South Asian theaters. Quote, Jessica's breathing had become more controlled, the kind of measured rhythm that suggested she was managing stress through techniques learned in survival training. And now? Now they're asking about a female operative with advanced marksmanship training who participated in the Kashmir operation and subsequently transitioned to civilian contractor status in the southwestern United States. The level of detail was chilling in its precision. Rodriguez understood that hostile intelligence services had developed enough specific information about Jessica to make her current identity and location vulnerable to discovery. The casual civilian contractor facade that had fooled military instructors all morning wouldn't provide any protection against professional intelligence operatives. Private First Class Kim had abandoned any pretense of conducting his own training and was openly listening to the conversation, his young face showing the kind of fascination mixed with growing alarm that came from realizing he was witnessing events that belonged in thriller novels rather than routine military life. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he whispered urgently, "should we be hearing this?" Rodriguez shook her head slightly but made no move to dismiss him or the other personnel who were equally transfixed. The conversation was unfolding in a semi-public setting, which suggested that Blackwood either didn't care about security protocols or was deliberately allowing the information to be overheard for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. Jessica had begun pacing slightly, a subtle movement that suggested she was processing multiple scenarios and calculating response options. When she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of professional detachment that indicated she was shifting into operational thinking rather than personal emotional response. "What's the assessment of immediate threat level? High enough that I'm here personally, instead of delegating this conversation to subordinates. High enough that we've been monitoring your activities through unofficial channels to ensure your safety." The casual admission that Jessica had been under surveillance sent another chill through the gathered personnel. Rodriguez realized that Jessica's presence at Fort Brennan might have been known to federal authorities before she'd even arrived, which raised questions about whether her contractor qualification was genuine business or part of a larger security operation. Blackwood gestured toward Jessica's gear bag and the evidence of her morning shooting performance. "The fact that you're maintaining advanced marksmanship proficiency suggests you're already aware that civilian life might not be permanent. Or it suggests that some habits are hard to break. Is that what this is, a habit or preparation?" The question struck at the heart of Jessica's current situation. Rodriguez understood that they were witnessing someone who existed in the liminal space between military and civilian life, maintaining capabilities that suggested she hadn't fully committed to either identity. Jessica stopped pacing and looked directly at Blackwood with the kind of steady focus that had characterized her shooting performance throughout the morning. "What exactly are you asking me, Commander?" "I'm asking whether you're ready to come back in from the cold. Whether you're prepared to accept protection and support in exchange for returning to active service in a capacity that uses your skills without requiring field deployment." The offer was clearly something that had been discussed before, but Jessica's response suggested ongoing reluctance that went beyond simple career preferences. Her hesitation seemed rooted in deeper concerns about the personal cost of returning to a world she'd deliberately left behind. "And if I decline?" Blackwood's expression grew more serious, taking on the somber tone of someone who understood the implications of the intelligence he was sharing. "Then you continue living as a civilian contractor while hostile intelligence services develop increasingly detailed information about your identity, location, and daily routines. Eventually, they'll have enough information to make direct contact." Direct contact was clearly a euphemism for something far more dangerous than casual surveillance. Rodriguez felt her stomach tighten as she realized that Jessica's exceptional shooting skills might soon be needed for purposes far more serious than qualification maintenance. Staff Sergeant Donovan had been listening with growing comprehension of how badly he'd misjudged the morning situation. The woman he'd dismissed as an incompetent civilian contractor was apparently someone whose military background had made her a target for hostile intelligence operations. His casual mockery now seemed not just unprofessional but potentially dangerous to someone who was dealing with genuine security threats. "Ma'am," he said quietly, approaching Jessica with visible discomfort, "I owe you an apology. We had no idea." Jessica turned to look at him, and for the first time since Commander Blackwood's arrival, she showed something approaching a smile. "You weren't supposed to have an idea." That was the point. The gracious response only emphasized how completely the instructors had failed to recognize what they were dealing with. Rodriguez realized that Jessica's civilian contractor facade had been carefully constructed to avoid exactly the kind of attention that exceptional performance might draw. Blackwood studied the exchange with interest, as if he was evaluating Jessica's ability to maintain operational security while interacting with personnel who lacked appropriate clearances. "The cover identity was well constructed," he observed, "but maintaining it is becoming more difficult as time passes." "Because I'm not the only one who knows what to look for," Jessica replied. acknowledging the fundamental problem with long-term undercover operations. Skills and capabilities that were necessary for survival eventually became visible to people who understood their significance. Commander Blackwood reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, the kind of official communication that suggested formal rather than casual contact. These are the details of the current threat assessment, along with our recommendations for enhanced security measures. Whether you accept our offer or not, you need to understand what you're dealing with. Jessica accepted the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. And if I take time to consider the options? Time is a luxury that's becoming increasingly scarce. The intelligence suggests that hostile contact could occur within the next 30 to 60 days. The timeline was alarmingly short, suggesting that whatever forces were interested in Jessica's background were moving from surveillance to active operations. Rodriguez understood that they were witnessing someone being forced to choose between the civilian life she'd built and the military world she'd tried to leave behind. Young Marcus Webb, the reservist who'd been so confident about Jessica's likely poor performance, found the courage to speak despite the intimidating presence of federal authority and classified discussions. "Ma'am, what unit were you actually with?" Quote, Jessica looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth to share with someone who lacked the clearances to understand the full story. "Units that don't appear on organizational charts," she said finally. "Operations that don't exist in official records." It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that her military service had involved classified activities, while avoiding specific details that might compromise ongoing operations or reveal information to unauthorized personnel. Blackwood nodded approvingly at her discretion. Suffice it to say that her service record includes operations that remain classified at the highest levels, the kind of missions that generate legends within the intelligence community but never appear in public documentation. Rodriguez felt pieces of the morning's puzzle finally clicking into place. Jessica's exceptional shooting, her careful deflection of questions about her background, her professional quality tattoo, and her apparent familiarity with Commander Blackwood all made sense when viewed through the lens of classified special operations. The woman they'd dismissed as a civilian contractor requiring routine qualification was actually someone whose military service had been significant enough to attract ongoing attention from hostile intelligence services. Her presence at Fort Brennan represented not incompetence requiring remedial training, but exceptional competence maintaining readiness for threats that existed in the classified world of international operations. "The Kashmir operation," Rodriguez said quietly, putting together fragments of the conversation she'd overheard. "That was the mountain reconnaissance mission where you lost team members." Jessica's expression grew somber at the mention of the operation that had clearly left lasting emotional scars. 12 personnel inserted for intelligence gathering in terrain that should have been impossible to traverse. Weather conditions that grounded all aircraft and reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Enemy forces that had been tracking our approach for days before we realized we'd been compromised. The bare facts conveyed only a fraction of what must have been an extraordinary test of human endurance and professional competence under impossible circumstances. Rodriguez understood that she was hearing about the kind of mission that pushed special operations personnel beyond normal limits and generated the kinds of skills that Jessica had demonstrated throughout the morning. Blackwood added context that revealed the broader significance of the operation. The intelligence gathered during that mission prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of civilians. The extraction under impossible weather conditions became a case study in advanced operational planning, but the personal cost was significant. Jessica's voice carried the weight of leadership decisions made under extreme pressure when she continued the story. Williams took a sniper round during the final extraction phase. Chen was caught in an avalanche triggered by explosive charges we used to clear the extraction route. Both died within sight of the landing zone. The stark recounting revealed the source of the guilt and trauma that had apparently driven Jessica's transition to civilian life. Rodriguez realized that exceptional military service often came with psychological costs that made returning to normal life extraordinarily difficult. Private First Class Kim, who'd been listening with growing comprehension of the magnitude of Jessica's background, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Will you go back?" Jessica looked around at the assembled personnel, the instructors who'd mocked her performance, the young soldiers who'd learned something important about judging people by appearances, and the range staff who'd witnessed an extraordinary demonstration of capabilities they'd never seen before. "I built a life outside that world for good reasons," she said finally, "but sometimes the world doesn't give you the luxury of staying out." Commander Blackwood extended his hand in a gesture that carried both professional respect and personal understanding. Whatever you decide, Jessica, know that your service made a difference. The people you saved, the operations you made possible, the intelligence you gathered, it all mattered. Jessica shook his hand briefly. Thank you, Commander. I'll review the materials and make my decision. As Blackwood and his escorts prepared to leave, he turned back to address the assembled personnel who'd witnessed the morning's revelations. What you've heard today involves matters of national security that require discretion. I trust that everyone understands the importance of keeping this information appropriately controlled. It wasn't a threat, but it was a clear reminder that they'd been exposed to information that exceeded their normal clearance levels and carried responsibilities that extended beyond their usual duties. After the convoy departed, leaving only the sound of diesel engines fading into the distance, the range remained unusually quiet. Jessica finished packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the morning, but now everyone understood they were watching someone whose capabilities belonged in a completely different category of military service. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached her as she prepared to leave. "Ma'am, I want you to know that what happened here this morning, the way you were treated initially, that doesn't represent our best professional standards." Jessica shouldered her gear bag and looked around the range one final time. "You reacted to what you saw. Most people in my position would prefer that reaction to immediate recognition. Because recognition brings attention you don't want. Because recognition brings complications that make civilian life impossible to maintain." Rodriguez understood that Jessica's exceptional performance had created exactly the kind of visibility that her cover identity was designed to avoid. By demonstrating her true capabilities, she'd revealed herself to people who now understood that her civilian contractor status didn't tell the complete story. As Jessica walked toward the main gate, Donovan found himself watching her departure with a mixture of professional respect and personal embarrassment. "Sergeant Rodriguez, do you think she'll go back?" Rodriguez considered the question while watching Jessica's figure disappear through the gate and into whatever uncertain future awaited her. "I think she'll do whatever she believes is necessary to protect the people who matter to her, whether that means returning to active service or finding another way to deal with the threats she's facing." The sun was beginning its afternoon descent, casting longer shadows across the concrete barriers and steel framework of the range. Other personnel would cycle through in the coming days, conducting their routine qualifications and maintaining their basic marksmanship skills. But the range would never quite feel the same to those who'd witnessed the morning's extraordinary demonstration of capabilities that belonged in legends rather than routine training. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez would read intelligence reports about a successful counterintelligence operation that had neutralized a hostile surveillance network operating in the southwestern United States. The reports would be heavily classified, but they would mention that all enemy operatives had been eliminated by an unknown asset who demonstrated exceptional marksmanship under difficult conditions. Rodriguez would study those reports for a long time, thinking about winter sky eyes and perfect groupings and the ghost of a smile from someone who'd learned that sometimes the most important service happens in the shadows, protected by legends that never appear in official records but are whispered about in the corners of facilities, where people understand that freedom has a price that's paid by those willing to remain invisible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.